Ok, uno, dos, sí, ok.
Están bien sucias las cosas, oye. Ay, caray. ¿Ya hablaste? ¿Sí se oye? Uno, dos, bueno, bueno. No tiene eco. Go, 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 go. Gracias. ¿Sí se ve o lo pongo? No sé. De la letra grande. Sí va Perrotini y al lado este señor. Se supone que sí, ¿no? Digamos que él es invitado a anfitrión de la facultad. Y si viene esto Vega va aquí en medio, supongo. Pero necesito ver, ahorita que lleguen, para cachar si llega uno. Y si ahorita vengo volada por el otro personificador y el vaso.
See? Yeah. No? We're good to go. Yeah. I remember you saying that. Yeah. It wasn't pulling its weight. Well, I would introduce you. Yeah. I introduce this oh, yeah, water, right? It is water. You know, when I first came to school, to follow a conference, I mean, and I was a translator. I mean, actually, they got me to translate everything, even though that was not my job. See, I remember 10 years ago, you used to hire translation. Yeah, that's fine. But that's, I mean, and then I got resistant. Lots of people accused me of introducing the English language in music, and then I didn't pay. So I pushed forward. And then afterwards, things began changing, and nowadays you don't need a translator for students to follow. And the German is bilingual. Ah, exactly, right. Yeah, because they were, the leftists were changing. Nacho, Thomas, how are you? How you doing? Nacho.
Muchas gracias por asistir a esta conferencia. Sin duda alguna, el día de hoy tenemos a un gran conferencista, el doctor Thomas Paley, que generosamente aceptó nuestra invitación para venir a conversar con nosotros. La conferencia del día de hoy es una anticipación de que haremos en aproximadamente un par de semanas del 25 aniversario de la independencia del Banco de México. En consecuencia, la conferencia del doctor Thomas Paley el día de hoy se inscribe en el marco de esa efemérides que se... Entonces, yo le agradezco a Tom por haber aceptado esta invitación. So many thanks, Tom, for coming, taking the time to come to Mexico. Tom ha estado aquí con nosotros varias veces, así es que pues ya es un colega de casa, es conocido por muchos académicos de nuestra facultad. Y bien, yo le he pedido a Tom que contribuya con un tema relacionado con la independencia del Banco Central, y como me ha conversado a través de varios correos electrónicos, he estado preparando esta conferencia para el día de hoy. En realidad, fui su alumno hace muchos años y él ha venido trabajando estos temas de teoría y política monetaria hace mucho tiempo. Y de hecho, el tema que nos va a hablar hoy, amén de que lo preparó especialmente para el día de hoy, pues hace unos momentos, de suerte que creo que tendremos una charla sumamente rica. Sin duda alguna, el tema de la independencia del Banco Central, no solo del de México, sino en general, la independencia de los bancos centrales en el mundo, es un tema sumamente importante, ¿verdad? La independencia del Banco de México ocurrió en los años que varios bancos centrales también se convirtieron en autónomos, ¿verdad? El Banco Central de Europa, muchos otros bancos, ¿verdad? Adoptaron la autonomía del Banco Central. Por tanto, es una efeméride que seguramente se estará celebrando no solamente en México, sino en muchos países, pero al mismo tiempo es un asunto que exige nuestra reflexión, nuestro análisis para discutir cuál es el significado. Primero que nada, las causas que conducen a la independencia del Banco Central y cuál es el significado que tiene la independencia del Banco Central para el funcionamiento de la economía en general. En consecuencia, un problema para organizar estas conferencias, la del día de hoy la tendremos próximamente, el día 26 y 27 de agosto, en este mismo auditorio, que es de extraordinaria importancia para nuestro país y la economía internacional. Tom Paley es un economista que tiene su base en Washington y trabaja con muchas instituciones progresistas en Estados Unidos, y actualmente es el coeditor de una revista muy importante que ustedes deben conocer, y si no, les invito a que la revisen. La Review of Keynesian Economics es una revista, digamos, relativamente joven, pero para su juventud ha tenido un impacto muy importante en el debate tanto de teoría como de política económica. Tom es coeditor de esta revista y es, en consecuencia, un motor muy importante para que esa publicación se mantenga y aumente en su calidad. Sin más preámbulo, quiero, además de volver a agradecer a Tom su visita, cederle la palabra. Vamos a organizar la charla del día de hoy de la siguiente manera. Tom hablará por un espacio de 30, 40, 45 minutos, lo que a él le plazca, y después procederemos a una ronda o varias rondas quizá de comentarios, de preguntas de parte de ustedes, ¿verdad? Quiero que se sientan en confianza de expresar sus pues, preguntas, sus comentarios en inglés si lo prefieren. Y si no, lo pueden hacer en castellano. Tom entiende bastante castellano, pero yo estoy aquí disponible para traducir en caso de que sea necesario. Así es que con confianza pueden plantear sus inquietudes, particularmente porque no es frecuente que tengamos en nuestra facultad a un economista del fuste de Tom Paley, y no va a ser tampoco sencillo tener a Tom con frecuencia en nuestra facultad. Entonces, por favor, Tom, the floor is yours, and you have, I mean, time is open for you.
Gracias, gracias Ignacio. Buenas tardes a todos. I am in Spanish. Okay, well, 2019 is the 25th anniversary of the Bank of Mexico's shift towards increased central bank independence. 2019 is also the 20th anniversary of the founding of the European Central Bank, which is actually the most independent central bank in the world. So those anniversaries are part of a wave that reflects the triumph of the idea of independent central banks. Now, the idea of independence was developed and promoted by economists, and it is now hegemonic. Great Britain, the United States was always independent, Mexico. I'll show you some data on that, just how global the taper has been. It is supported by both conservatives and social democrats, so it's politically hegemonic as well. And it's completely dominant within mainstream economics, where it's supported by both the saltwater MIT school and the freshwater Chicago School of Economics. And those two schools define the spectrum of what is permissible economic thought. Now, central bank independence is a very important policy issue, enduring significant distributional and fiscal implications. Those interventions triggered growing public concern about central bank independence. They're doing such important things. Should they really be independent? Now, the problem is the dominance of independence means that we have a rigged debate in which critics are dismissed as populists or are called non-adults. Step one is to argue that there is a problem of inflation-prone government. Step two is then to argue that independence is the solution to that problem. Today, I want to challenge the case and argue that it is on false politics and false economics. Instead, I'm going to argue that central bank independence is actually a product of neoliberal economics, and it aims to advance and institutionalize, bear that word in mind. It rests on false politics, and it fails according to to impartially and neutrally operationalize those goals. Lastly, I'm going to argue that economists are deeply implicated by the debate over independence. Why? Because it is a very grave misrepresentation to claim that independence solves a fundamental public interest problem. And when economists say themselves accomplices. Now, the 1980s and 1990s was a period of significant increase in the extent of central bank independence. Figure 1 behind me shows the change in central bank independence in advanced economies and emerging economies in the 1980s compared to 2003. So the 45-degree line marks unchanged independence. Countries that are below the 45-degree line had an increase in independence, while countries
Now, what's important about these figures here is the two graphs show central bank independence increased in both advanced countries and in emerging market and developing economies. In the advanced countries, which is on my right, on the right-hand figure, significantly independent with an index score of almost 0.8. The creation of the euro shifted all the central banks of the Eurozone countries to a position of more independence, in fact, maximum independence. And on the left-hand side, the figure for emerging market and developing economies shows the global nature of this shift. As regards the Bank of Mexico, its independence score jumped from just under 0.4 to just under 0.7. So this is this global story that we're talking about. Now, I'll keep it on there. Now, figure 1 contains 4 important insights. First, the shift to increased independence was global. The shift occurred in the 1980s and 1990s, which is when neoliberalism became hegemonic. Third, the idea of central bank independence is an economist. The idea of central bank independence is an economist's idea. Economists in public policy and in shaping the economy. They change the economy. What economists say, if it is adopted by governments as policy, it will then change the economy. Fourth, the shift to central bank independence in emerging economies shows the powerful influence thinking in advanced economies on the policies of emerging market economies. The thinking starts in the advanced economies and is transported, exported to the emerging economies. So central bank independence is the idea of neoliberal economists in advanced economies, and it was exported to emerging economies via such channels as elite universities, Harvard University, Stanford University, by central bank forums when the governors of central banks get together, and of course by the IMF. And that will come back up in the story. Now, a problem with the discussion of central bank independence is that there has been a proliferation of meanings. If you go to the Wikipedia page on central bank independence, it identifies 6 forms: institutional independence, goal independence, functional and operational independence, personnel independence, and operational independence. However, actually these categories are overlapping. And that's because central banks have leeway in operationalizing their goals. For instance, the Federal Reserve is mandated with the goal of price stability. But what's the meaning of price stability? It's left to the Federal Reserve. Is it 0 inflation, 1% inflation, 2% inflation, even 3% inflation? So that when it comes to the goal, it's left up to the central bank. And that to me is how hard goals pin down the central bank's target as an exact number. A soft goal gives the central bank some freedom to define its target. They are all problematic because the underlying justification for independence rests on false politics and economics. It's a general critique of the concept of independence. Now, the economic rationale for central bank independence derives from the Chicago School approach to political economy. And the Chicago School emphasizes the idea of government failure. The Chicago argument is government failure occurs because of incompetence and self-interest on the part of politicians and bureaucrats. Government failure is then used to argue against activist government and in favor of minimalist government. I think you're probably all familiar with that Chicago School approach to political economy. And the argument for central bank independence rests on a very similar line of reasoning. And that's why independence is so popular with neoliberals. Central bank independence, the claim is politicians engage in opportunistic, inflationary monetary policy that imposes costs, economic costs on society. And I suppose an example of such opportunism would be people say that politicians try to improve their electoral prospect, in which politicians can spur the economy prior to the election, causing a temporary boom that voters like. After the election, politicians cause a recession, which agents quickly forget about, voters quickly forget about because they have political amnesia. That wipes the slate clean and sets the stage for another pre-election boom prior to the next election. So the economy exhibits cycles owing to political forces, but that is suboptimal as economic volatility reduces economic well-being. And so the argument is an independent central bank, which prevents that pattern, would therefore be welfare enhancing. And what's interesting is Nordhaus in 1975 recognized that an independent central bank might solve the problem, but he was writing in a pre-neoliberal era, and he only when the politics changed. Before, in the 50s and 60s and 70s, it was unacceptable because we were living in a different political time. Now, Nordhaus's model was actually rejected by new classical macroeconomics because it used non-rational expectations. The type of cycle, the pattern he described is not possible if people have rational expectations. So instead, Barrow and Gordon provided an alternative justification with rational expectation. In their model, policymakers are viewed as benefiting from positive output shocks which push the economy below the natural rate of unemployment. Incentive to engage in surprise money shocks to push a surprise boom on the economy. However, the public has rational expectations and recognizes this, and it incorporates that behavior into its inflation expectations. The result is an equilibrium where you end up at the natural rate of unemployment, but you end up with a higher rate of inflation. Policymakers' incentive to try and exploit surprise inflation. Now, the problem that Barrow and Gordon, that their critique rests on, is the problem of time inconsistency. Policymakers engage in surprise inflationary policy. Central bank independence is supposed to solve that problem. It's supposed to handcuff politicians so they don't do this. Now, replacing, and that's I'm going to argue that supposed solution superficially looks good. It's actually completely false. It doesn't work. Why? Replacing a government policymaker with an independent central banker, the independence argument runs into the very fundamental problem of political economy of who will guard the guardians. If you impose a hard target, that might bind the central bank, but in that case, the government must be willing to act on failures of the central bank to hit the target. If politicians are self-interested, why would they? So if politicians do act the target, then that's a way of saying that politicians are not really selfish. Now, Ken Rogoff, who's a conservative central banker, now appointing a conservative central banker may guard against inflation surprises, but guess what? It opens the door to deflation surprises, which may have even worse effects. A conservative central banker inevitably brings her own preferences and views to the policy table, has raised new time consistency problems with the conservative banker solution. According to conventional macroeconomics, one way to escape the zero lower bound problem on nominal, but a conservative central banker will be reluctant to deliver that future inflation, deliver in the future. The implication is then when you're at the zero lower bound, one should appoint a reckless, populist central banker who loves inflation and will deliver inflation later. But the moment you escape the zero lower bound, well, then you should fire that banker and then reappoint the conservative central banker. So the whole argument always keeps imploding on itself. There is a time inconsistency built into the very microeconomic logic that is supposed to solve the problem of time inconsistency. So it suggests that something else is going on with the move to independent central banks. And that's our challenge, something else. Why have we a structure that you very quickly can unpick is logically incoherent? Instead, what I'm going to argue, conservative, I'm going to argue that politicians are moving to independent central banks out of self-interest. And that is the clue to understand, instead of serving political interests. Now, the critiques I've just worked through are about the microeconomic consistency of justifications for central bank independence. A whole second set of critiques concern the assumptions about politics and macroeconomics. So as regards politics, the model that justifies independence has a political structure. If you read the papers, it has a political structure that has on one hand a self-interested government, and that self-interested government is set against a unified public. It's government versus the public. That's the political structure that these conservative papers have. And that reflects the Chicago school perspective, which tends to paint government as the enemy of the public. But that's not the way real-world politics is structured. In the real world, government is a politically contested space. You in Mexico know that very well. And the public is divided, with the conventional division being between capital and labor. And the absence of that division has an enormous smuggled-in implications. If it's not in your paper, you're not going to see it, and you're going to smuggle in all sorts of misleading understandings. A means for capital to gain greater control over central banks. Now, as regards macroeconomics, the case for independence is constructed Phillips curve, neutrality of money, superneutrality of money. What is the importance of those macroeconomic assumptions? Essentially, they serve to exclude politics. Why?